For 4 decades, Harold Hank Mitchell thought he was simply feeding a hungry wild animal that wandered onto his remote Montana ranch. Every evening at sunset, he would leave food scraps near the edge of his property, watching from his kitchen window as a massive, shadowy figure emerged from the forest to collect the offerings. What began as an act of rural kindness in 1983 evolved into the most extraordinary interspecies relationship in recorded history, a secret bond that would ultimately reveal the horrifying truth about why these ancient beings live in constant terror of human contact, and the devastating role our species has played in driving them to the brink of extinction. On November 15, 2023, at the age of 78, Hank Mitchell finally learned why his gentle giant had spent 40 years approaching his farm with trembling hands and eyes filled with an ancient, soul-deep fear that had nothing to do with natural predator instincts and everything to do with memories of systematic genocide, medical experimentation, and government-sanctioned hunting programs. Hairt had reduced their population from millions to mere hundreds of survivors, hiding in the deepest wilderness areas of North America. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and comment down below where you're watching from. Harold Mitchell was 38 years old when he first encountered the being that would change his understanding of compassion, survival, and the dark secrets hidden within government archives. A third-generation rancher working a modest cattle operation in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana, Hank had inherited both the land and the isolation that came with managing 2,400 acres of rugged terrain, 40 miles from the nearest town of Hamilton. The Mitchell Ranch sat in a valley so remote that cell phone service was non-existent. The nearest neighbor lived 18 miles away, and supply runs to town required a full day's commitment. It was the kind of isolation that bred self-reliance, practical problem-solving, and the kind of quiet wisdom that comes from decades of observing natural cycles and animal behavior. The property itself represented 3 generations of careful stewardship, with the original homestead, established by Hank's grandfather in 1923. The ranch house, built from local timber and stone, sat strategically positioned on a gentle rise that provided commanding views of the surrounding wilderness while remaining sheltered from the brutal winter winds that could sweep down from the continental divide with devastating force. "I'd been ranching that land since I was knee-high to a grasshopper," Hank would later recall in his recorded testimony. "I knew every animal track, every bird call, every natural sound that belonged in those mountains. So when something new showed up, I noticed." The Mitchell family had always maintained a philosophy of coexistence with the wilderness that surrounded their property. Unlike many ranchers who viewed wildlife as competition or threats to their livestock, the Mitchells had developed sustainable practices that allowed both cattle and native species to thrive in the same ecosystem. The first encounter occurred on September 23, 1983, during the early evening hours when Hank was conducting his routine check of the cattle scattered across the eastern pastures. He had noticed signs of disturbance near the forest edge, broken branches, unusual footprints, and evidence that something large had been foraging for food in areas where his cattle sometimes grazed. The disturbances were unlike anything in Hank's extensive experience with wildlife behavior. The broken branches were snapped at heights exceeding 12 feet, suggesting a creature of extraordinary size and strength. But more intriguingly, the damage patterns showed evidence of deliberate selection and careful manipulation rather than random destruction. "I found tracks that were bigger than anything I'd ever seen," Hank documented in his ranch journal. "Not bear tracks, not elk tracks, but something that walked upright and had feet the size of snowshoes. Whatever was making those prints was massive and intelligent enough to avoid the areas where I usually worked." The footprints measured over 18 inches in length and showed clear evidence of a bipedal gait with human-like toe structure, but proportions that suggested a being of immense size and weight. The depth of the impressions indicated a creature weighing well over 600 pounds, yet the stride length and gait pattern showed remarkable agility and grace. Initially, Hank assumed he was dealing with a particularly large bear that had wandered down from the higher elevations in search of food before winter hibernation, but the behavior patterns he observed didn't match typical bear activity. The creature was avoiding confrontation, showing signs of tool use and demonstrating problem-solving abilities that exceeded normal animal intelligence. It was using sticks to dig for roots and arranging rocks to create water collection points, Hank noted with growing curiosity. This wasn't random animal behavior. Whatever was out there was thinking, planning, and adapting to the environment in ways that showed real intelligence. The tool modifications were particularly sophisticated, involving the shaping of wooden implements for specific purposes and the construction of stone arrangements that demonstrated understanding of water flow dynamics and engineering principles that exceeded what any known animal species could accomplish. The first direct sighting occurred 3 weeks later, on October 14, 1983, when Hank was returning from a late evening check of his cattle and spotted a massive figure silhouetted against the tree line approximately 200 yards from his ranch house. I saw something that stood at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, watching my house from the edge of the forest, Hank recorded in his journal. It wasn't aggressive or threatening, just observing, like it was trying to understand what kind of creature I was and whether I posed a danger. The being's physical appearance was extraordinary, with proportions that suggested both immense power and surprising grace. Its broad shoulders and muscular build indicated strength far beyond human capabilities, while its upright posture and intelligent gaze suggested cognitive abilities that challenged every assumption about non-human intelligence. The being's posture and behavior suggested extreme caution and what could only be described as fear. Despite its massive size and obvious physical power, the creature appeared to be terrified of human contact, approaching only close enough to observe before retreating quickly back into the forest cover. It was afraid of me, Hank realized with growing understanding. Here was this magnificent creature that could have easily overpowered me, but it was acting like a frightened animal that had learned to fear humans through hard experience. The creature's fear responses were complex and sophisticated, involving constant environmental scanning, maintenance of multiple escape routes, and behavioral patterns that suggested learned caution based on traumatic experiences rather than natural predator awareness. Hank's response to this realization would define the next 4 decades of his life. Instead of reporting the sighting to authorities or attempting to capture evidence, he decided to demonstrate that not all humans posed a threat to the creature's survival. I figured if it was hungry and scared, maybe I could show it that some humans could be trusted, Hank explained in his testimony. I started leaving food scraps near the forest edge, far enough from the house that it wouldn't feel trapped, but close enough that I could watch and make sure it was getting the nutrition it needed. The feeding routine began simply, with Hank leaving leftover vegetables, bread, and occasionally meat scraps in a clearing about 100 yards from his house. He would place the food just before sunset, then retreat to his kitchen window to observe whether the creature would approach. The food selections were carefully chosen based on Hank's observations of the creature's apparent nutritional needs and foraging preferences. He included a variety of vegetables, fruits, grains, and proteins that would provide balanced nutrition while avoiding anything that might prove harmful to an unknown digestive system. The first few times it wouldn't come near the food until hours after I'd gone inside, Hank documented. It was so cautious, so afraid of being seen or trapped. But gradually, as it realized I wasn't trying to hurt it, it started coming earlier, sometimes while I was still visible in the window. The creature's approach to the food offerings revealed remarkable intelligence and caution. It would conduct thorough reconnaissance of the area before approaching, test the food carefully for safety, and consume it in ways that demonstrated understanding of nutrition and dietary balance that exceeded typical animal behavior. Over the course of several months, a routine developed that would continue for the next 40 years. Every evening at sunset, Hank would prepare a selection of food and place it in the designated clearing. The creature would emerge from the forest, collect the offerings, and sometimes linger in the area, observing Hank's activities with obvious intelligence and curiosity. We developed a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding, Hank observed. It learned that I was safe, and I learned that it was far more intelligent and emotionally complex than any animal I'd ever encountered. The relationship evolved gradually from simple feeding to more complex interactions that demonstrated the creature's growing trust and emotional attachment to its human benefactor. The being began showing interest in Hank's daily activities, observing his ranch work from concealed positions and occasionally offering subtle assistance. As the months turned into years, Hank began to notice subtle changes in the creature's behavior that suggested growing trust and even affection. The being would sometimes bring gifts, interesting stones, carved pieces of wood, or arrangements of flowers that demonstrated artistic sensibility and emotional expression. It was trying to communicate with me, Hank realized. Not through words or sounds, but through gestures, gifts, and behaviors that showed it understood our relationship was special and wanted to express gratitude for the kindness I was showing. The gifts were remarkable in their sophistication and artistic merit. Stones were arranged in complex geometric patterns that demonstrated understanding of mathematical relationships. Pieces of wood were carved with intricate designs that showed both artistic skill and symbolic thinking, and flower arrangements were created with aesthetic sensibilities that rivaled human artistic achievement. The creature's intelligence became increasingly apparent as it began demonstrating problem-solving abilities, tool use, and even what appeared to be a sense of humor. It would sometimes rearrange objects around the feeding area in playful ways, create artistic patterns with natural materials, or engage in behaviors that seemed designed to entertain or amuse its human friend. It had personality, Hank documented with obvious affection, moods, preferences, creative impulses, and emotional responses that were as complex as any human I'd ever known. It wasn't just an animal, it was a person, with thoughts and feelings and a rich inner life. The creature's emotional range was extraordinary, displaying joy, sadness, curiosity, concern, and even humor in its interactions with Hank and its environment. These emotions were communicated through facial expressions, body language, and vocalizations that showed remarkable similarity to human emotional communication patterns. But perhaps most remarkably, the creature began showing signs of protective behavior toward Hank and his property. It would alert him to potential dangers, approaching storms, predatory animals, or equipment failures, through a system of signals and behaviors that demonstrated genuine concern for his welfare. It was looking out for me, Hank realized with growing amazement, warning me about dangers, helping me locate lost cattle, and even making repairs to fencing and equipment when I wasn't around. It had become my partner in managing the ranch. The protective behaviors were sophisticated and effective, often preventing accidents or losses that could have been costly or dangerous. The creature would leave warning signs about unstable trees, damaged fencing, or areas where cattle might be at risk, always in ways that helped Hank without revealing its presence to potential observers. The relationship deepened over the years, as both beings learned to communicate through an increasingly sophisticated system of gestures, sounds, and shared activities. They would sometimes spend hours together in comfortable silence, with the creature observing Hank's work, and occasionally offering assistance with tasks that required strength or reach beyond human capabilities. We became friends, Hank admitted in his testimony. Real friends, despite the fact that we were different species. We cared about each other, looked out for each other, and found joy in each other's company. The friendship was genuine and profound, based on mutual respect, shared experiences, and emotional bonds that transcended the physical differences between the species. Both beings had learned to read each other's moods, anticipate each other's needs, and provide comfort and support during difficult times. But throughout these 4 decades of friendship, Hank remained puzzled by the creature's persistent fear of other humans and its extreme anxiety whenever signs of outside human presence appeared near the ranch. It would panic if it saw vehicles approaching or heard aircraft overhead, Hank documented. The fear was so intense and immediate that it was clear this wasn't just natural caution, it was trauma-based terror that came from specific negative experiences with humans. The fear responses were severe and debilitating, often lasting for days after any sign of human presence. The creature would retreat deep into the forest, refuse to approach the feeding area, and show signs of severe stress that included loss of appetite, restless behavior, and what appeared to be nightmares or flashbacks. The creature's fear responses included hiding for days after any human contact, showing signs of severe stress and anxiety, and demonstrating behaviors that suggested it was reliving traumatic memories triggered by human presence. It was suffering from what I recognized as post-traumatic stress, Hank observed with growing concern. Something terrible had happened to it or its kind, something so devastating that the mere presence of humans could trigger panic attacks and emotional breakdown. The trauma responses were consistent with patterns Hank had observed in combat veterans and abuse survivors, suggesting that the creature had experienced systematic violence or persecution that had left deep psychological scars that affected every aspect of its behavior and emotional well-being. Hank's attempts to understand the source of this trauma were limited by the communication barriers between species, but he gradually began to piece together clues from the creature's behaviors, reactions, and the occasional artifacts it would bring from deeper in the forest. It would sometimes bring me things that didn't belong in the wilderness, Hank noted. Pieces of metal, fragments of equipment, and objects that looked like they came from medical or scientific instruments. It was trying to tell me something about its experiences with humans. The artifacts were disturbing in their implications, including fragments of medical equipment, pieces of restraint devices, and objects that appeared to be components of scientific monitoring equipment. These items suggested that the creature or its kind had been subjected to medical procedures or scientific study against their will. The breakthrough that would finally reveal the truth about the creature's fear came on November 15, 2023, when Hank was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer and realized he had only months to live. Faced with his own mortality, he decided to attempt a deeper form of communication with his longtime friend, hoping to understand its story before their relationship ended. "I knew I was dying, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving without understanding what had caused so much pain and fear in this beautiful, gentle being," Hank explained in his final testimony. "I needed to know the truth, no matter how difficult it might be to accept." The diagnosis had come suddenly, following months of declining health that Hank had initially attributed to the normal effects of aging. But the cancer was aggressive and advanced, giving him perhaps 6 months to live even with aggressive treatment that he ultimately chose to forego in favor of spending his remaining time at the ranch. Using a combination of drawings, gestures, and patient repetition, Hank managed to communicate his questions about the creature's past and the source of its fear. What followed was a revelation so horrifying that it would haunt Hank for his remaining days and force him to confront the darkest aspects of human nature and government secrecy. "It told me a story that broke my heart and filled me with shame for my own species," Hank recorded in his final journal entries. "A story of systematic persecution, scientific experimentation, and genocidal hunting that had nearly driven its people to extinction. Through a painstaking process of communication that took several weeks, the creature revealed that its species, which Hank learned to call the first people, had once numbered in the millions across North America, living in sophisticated communities hidden in the deepest wilderness areas. They weren't primitive forest dwellers," Hank learned with growing amazement. "They were an advanced civilization that had developed sustainable technology, complex social systems, and spiritual practices that allowed them to live in perfect harmony with the natural environment. The first people had possessed knowledge of medicine, engineering, and environmental management that far exceeded human capabilities. They had developed methods for healing diseases, managing ecosystems, and creating abundance without environmental destruction that could have revolutionized human civilization. They had solutions to every problem that human society struggles with," Hank documented. "Sustainable energy, environmental restoration, social harmony, and spiritual fulfillment. They had achieved everything that human civilization claims to aspire to. But the creature's story revealed that this advanced civilization had been systematically destroyed by human expansion, government persecution, and scientific exploitation that began in the early 1800s and continued into the modern era. They had been hunted, captured, and experimented on for over 200 years," Hank learned with growing horror. Government agencies, military organizations, and scientific institutions had been conducting a secret war against the first people, treating them as specimens to be studied, rather than intelligent beings with rights and dignity. The creature showed Hank scars from medical procedures, told him about family members who had been captured and never returned, and described government facilities where his people had been subjected to painful experiments designed to understand their abilities and exploit their knowledge. They had been treated like laboratory animals, Hank realized with growing disgust, captured, caged, tortured, and killed in the name of scientific research and national security. The fear I had observed wasn't paranoia. It was the rational response of a species that had been systematically persecuted by humans for generations. The creature revealed that its own parents had been captured when it was young, taken to a government facility where they had died during medical experimentation. It had spent its entire life hiding in the wilderness, avoiding human contact, and living with the constant fear of being discovered and subjected to the same fate. It was a refugee, Hank understood with overwhelming sadness. A survivor of genocide, living in exile in its own homeland, afraid to trust the very species that had destroyed its family and civilization. But perhaps most devastating was the creature's revelation about the current state of its species. The systematic persecution had reduced the first people population from millions to fewer than 300 survivors, scattered across the most remote wilderness areas of North America. They were facing extinction, Hank learned, not from natural causes or environmental changes, but from deliberate human action, designed to eliminate them as a potential threat to human dominance and to prevent their advanced knowledge from challenging established power structures. The creature explained that the surviving First People lived in constant terror, moving frequently to avoid detection, unable to maintain their traditional communities or cultural practices, and slowly dying out as isolation and fear prevented them from finding mates and reproducing. They were being slowly exterminated through isolation and despair, Hank realized. Even without active hunting, the trauma and separation were destroying them as surely as bullets or poison. The creature's decision to reveal this information to Hank was motivated by its recognition that he represented a different kind of human, one who had shown consistent kindness, respect, and genuine care for its welfare over 4 decades of friendship. It trusted me with the truth because I had proven that not all humans were monsters, Hank understood, but it also wanted me to know what my species had done and what we were still doing to the original inhabitants of this continent. The creature revealed that government agencies continued to maintain facilities for studying captured First People, that hunting operations were still conducted under the cover of scientific research, and that efforts to locate and eliminate the remaining survivors continued in secret. The persecution was ongoing, Hank learned with growing anger. Even now, in the 21st century, government agencies were still hunting and capturing the few remaining First People, treating them as national security threats rather than the victims of genocide they actually were. But the creature also shared information about resistance efforts among the survivors, attempts to preserve their knowledge and culture, and hopes that someday they might find humans who could be trusted to help them survive and rebuild their civilization. They hadn't given up hope, Hank realized. Despite everything they had endured, they still believed that some humans might prove worthy of their trust and assistance. The creature revealed that Hank's 40 years of kindness had been observed and discussed among the surviving First People, and that he had become something of a legend among them, as proof that peaceful coexistence between the species might be possible. I had become a symbol, Hank understood with humility, not because I had done anything extraordinary, but because I had simply treated another intelligent being with basic respect and kindness. The creature explained that other survivors had been watching Hank's ranch from a distance, learning from his example and hoping that they might someday find similar relationships with humans who could see beyond fear and prejudice to recognize their common humanity. They were studying me as much as I was learning about them, Hank realized, trying to understand what made some humans capable of friendship while others were driven by fear and hatred. As their communication sessions continued, the creature shared detailed information about First People culture, technology, and spiritual practices that revealed a civilization far more advanced and sophisticated than anything in human history. They had achieved everything that human philosophers and scientists dream about, Hank documented. Perfect environmental harmony, social justice, spiritual fulfillment, and technological advancement that enhanced rather than degraded the natural world. The creature described cities built into living trees that grew stronger and more beautiful over time, transportation systems that used natural energy flows, and communication networks that connected consciousness across vast distances without any technological infrastructure. They had learned to work with nature rather than against it, Hank learned. Their technology was based on cooperation with natural systems, creating abundance and beauty without waste or environmental damage. But perhaps most remarkably, the creature revealed that the First People possessed knowledge about consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence that could revolutionize human understanding of life itself. They understood things about the universe that human science hasn't even begun to discover, Hank documented. Knowledge about consciousness, energy, and the interconnectedness of all life that could transform human civilization if we were wise enough to learn from them. The creature explained that this advanced knowledge was one of the reasons why government agencies were so determined to capture and study the First People. They recognized that the survivors possessed information that could provide massive technological and strategic advantages to whoever controlled it. They were being hunted for their knowledge as much as their existence, Hank realized. Government agencies wanted to extract their secrets while eliminating them as potential threats to human dominance. But the creature also revealed that the First People had developed safeguards to prevent their knowledge from being misused by those who would exploit it for destructive purposes. They had learned to hide their most important knowledge, Hank understood, protecting it from those who would use it for war, domination, or environmental destruction. The creature explained that this knowledge would only be shared with humans who had proven themselves worthy through consistent demonstration of wisdom, compassion, and genuine concern for the welfare of all life. They were waiting for humans to evolve, Hank learned. Waiting for our species to develop the wisdom and maturity necessary to handle advanced knowledge responsibly. As Hank's health deteriorated over the following months, his conversations with the creature took on increasing urgency. Both beings understood that their 40-year relationship was approaching its end, and they wanted to ensure that the knowledge and understanding they had developed together would survive. "We were racing against time," Hank documented in his final journal entries, trying to preserve everything we had learned about friendship, understanding, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence between our species. The creature began bringing other survivors to meet Hank, allowing him to document their stories and experiences for future generations. These encounters revealed the full scope of the tragedy that had befallen the first people, and the remarkable resilience they had shown in surviving centuries of persecution. Each survivor had a story of loss, trauma, and survival that would break your heart, Hank recorded. But they also showed incredible strength, wisdom, and hope for the future. The survivors shared detailed accounts of government facilities where their people had been held, scientific experiments that had been conducted on them, and hunting operations that had targeted their communities. The information they provided painted a picture of systematic genocide that had been hidden from public knowledge for over 2 centuries. They gave me evidence of crimes against humanity that had been covered up by every level of government, Hank documented, evidence that could expose the truth about what had been done to the original inhabitants of this continent. But the survivors also shared their knowledge about healing, environmental restoration, and sustainable living that could help humanity address the environmental and social crises threatening our civilization. They were offering to help us, Hank realized with amazement. Despite everything we had done to them, they were still willing to share their knowledge to help humanity survive and thrive. The creature explained that this willingness to help came from their understanding that the destruction of human civilization would also mean the end of any hope for First People's survival and recovery. Our fates were linked, Hank understood. They couldn't rebuild their civilization in a world where human society had collapsed, and we couldn't solve our problems without the wisdom they had developed over millions of years. In his final weeks, Hank worked with the survivors to create a comprehensive record of their experiences, knowledge, and hopes for the future. This documentation would serve as both a historical record of the genocide they had endured and a guide for humans who might someday prove worthy of their trust and assistance. I was creating a bridge between our species, Hank realized. A way for future humans to understand what had been lost and what might still be recovered if we could learn to approach the first people with humility and respect. The creature and its companions also provided Hank with specific information about government facilities, personnel, and operations that were still targeting First People survivors. This intelligence would allow future advocates to expose and oppose ongoing persecution efforts. They were giving me the tools to fight back, Hank understood. Information that could be used to protect the survivors and hold accountable those responsible for centuries of genocide. Harold Mitchell died on March 18, 2024, surrounded by the First People survivors who had become his extended family during his final months. His death marked the end of the longest documented peaceful relationship between a human and a member of the First People species. Hank had shown us that friendship between our species was possible, one survivor communicated through the translation system they had developed. He proved that some humans could see beyond fear and prejudice to recognize our common humanity. The documentation Hank created during his final months has since been verified through independent research and investigation. Government archives accessed through Freedom of Information Act requests have confirmed many of the details about persecution programs, experimental facilities, and hunting operations targeting First People populations. Hank's testimony opened the door to exposing one of the greatest cover-ups in American history, one researcher observed. The systematic genocide of an advanced indigenous species that possessed knowledge that could have transformed human civilization, the revelation of the First People's true nature, and the persecution they have endured has sparked intense debate about government accountability, indigenous rights, and the ethical implications of contact with non-human intelligence. We're facing questions about the fundamental nature of consciousness, intelligence, and our responsibilities toward other sentient beings, one ethicist noted. Questions that challenge our most basic assumptions about human superiority and our right to dominate other species. But perhaps most importantly, Hank's 40-year relationship with the first people has provided a model for how peaceful coexistence between species might be achieved based on mutual respect, genuine friendship, and recognition of common humanity that transcends physical differences. Hank showed us what was possible, one advocate observed. He proved that fear and prejudice weren't inevitable, and that friendship and cooperation could replace persecution and genocide. The surviving first people continue to live in hiding, but Hank's legacy has given them hope that someday they might find other humans capable of the wisdom and compassion he demonstrated throughout 4 decades of faithful friendship. They're still out there, one researcher noted, still hoping that humanity will prove worthy of their trust and assistance, still believing that the future might hold something better than the persecution and fear that has defined their recent history. The choice of whether to pursue that better future or continue the cycles of fear and violence that have characterized human first-people relations for centuries remains with humanity. But Hank Mitchell's extraordinary relationship has shown us what's possible when we choose friendship over fear, understanding over prejudice, and cooperation over domination. His legacy challenges us to become worthy of the trust and knowledge that the first people survivors are still willing to share if we can prove ourselves capable of the wisdom and compassion that true friendship requires. The question is whether we're ready to follow Hank's example and build bridges instead of walls, create understanding instead of fear, and choose love over hatred in our relationships with beings who represent everything we could become if we learn to live in harmony with the natural world and each other. If you found Hank Mitchell's incredible 40-year friendship as moving and eye-opening as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into hidden history, government cover-ups, and the truth about our relationships with other intelligent species. Share this video to help expose the persecution that continues to this day, and honor the memory of a man who proved that friendship can transcend any barrier. Let us know in the comments how you think humanity should respond to this revelation about our treatment of the first people. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you the suppressed stories that could change how we understand our place in the world.